Hi, and welcome back. Thanks again for joining me here for the process of building this instrument. It's fun to get to share this with everybody while we're going through social isolation, and hopefully it'll be fun for people even after that. So last time we planed the rib material so that it's all ready to use. So now the last thing that I have to do before I can make those ribs is finish making templates of them. And so today I'm going to show you how I create the shapes for those ribs in their flat form from the mold, and then show you the rough shaping of the first rib. Now, I know that everyone watching with me now that these are videos on YouTube may not have seen the live streams originally. So I wanted to take a moment to introduce you all or reintroduce you all to the Theorbo mold itself. This is a framework built of MDF and a eucalyptus reinforcing spine in the core there that defines the shape of the finished instrument. And these instruments are really geometrically fascinating in that they take a variety of, theoretically, hemispheres, and you can join those with flat planes, with even divisions of the width of each of those hemispheres. And that creates a series of lines where those planes join. And it gets somewhat complicated on an instrument like a Theorbo because these are not, in fact, hemispheres. As you can see, these are much shallower than they are broad. The radius changes. And that leads to some complex geometry, including, for example, the fact that the point where all these ribs meet is actually several inches below the belly of the instrument. So before I can start making ribs for this, I need to find a way, I need to make a template of what each of these planes look like if you were to unbend it and turn it into a flat plane, rather than one that is curved around the radii of this mold. So I can do that by taking a piece of drafting film and pinning it to the neck block. This is the only permanent part of the instrument you see here. And then stretching it over around to the tail end and marking all these high points, which mark the line where those two planes intersect, which I can then uncurl, and I now have a representation of this as a two-dimensional form that I can use to make my ribs. So now I need to transfer, or rather to translate, the series of dots on here that mark those high points into lines that represent the shape of this rib in between those points. And in order to do that, I use this flexible rule, which is very stiff on one plane and very flexible on another, and is used in drafting and design work to fair a curve or a line, particularly one that has an irregular radius or an irregular bend. So I will take it, I will line it up with at least 3 of these points, preferably more if I am able. And then I will be able to make my line. And I need to reference my mold to just double check a little note I left for myself there about the width of this. Yep. So I had 2 marks on a couple of these where the shape of the mold, I had a little bit of a question for myself about how that had been drawn. And so I made myself 2 sets of marks, a first and second mark that gave me the alternatives for how to interpret the shape of this. And now I know which one I need to use, so I line this up and I make my lines connecting them. These don't need to be absolutely perfect, but I still want them to be an approximation of the finished shape of the rib, because that will save me a lot of time later. I have seen some people building instruments who take the entire rib blank as a rectangle and just slowly shave it down to the correct shape. And if that works for them, very good. But to me, I prefer to first have a shape to be working toward. So that's why I do this process with a new mold like the one that I just showed you, which is a brand new, freshly made Theorbo mold I've never built before. I prefer to make these templates for myself, where I now have those lines. Same thing for the opposite side. And on an instrument where all of those cross sections on that mold are hemispheres, you get a symmetrical shape for the vast majority of the ribs. On an instrument like this, on a flat-backed instrument where there is that flattening of the shape, you actually get asymmetrical shapes in order to produce the pieces that become that three-dimensional object when you're cutting them out of a two-dimensional surface. So unlike a simpler lute where the rib is almost exclusively convex, there is actually a great deal of concavity on at least one side of these Theorbo ribs, which you can see here in that shape. Just a big banana. And these, if the mold is built well, and I checked this before this step, mirror onto the opposite side of the instrument. So I don't need to make a template for every rib. I need to make a template for half of the ribs and then flip it over to create the rib on the opposite side of the instrument. And so there, I've cut out my first rib. This template doesn't need to be perfect. It's not exactly on the line, but it is always over the line. And even as I'm putting this onto the material, the two ends I will skew several millimeters to the side to give extra material to take away as I fit this to the instrument. Eventually, when I know that this is a good rib and that I can produce a usable rib from this template, I will transfer it from this drafting film onto a piece of polycarbonate that will be a more permanent template for future use. But for now, rather than burn through polycarbonate and a bunch of time and then potentially discover that this is not a usable shape, I'm just going to use this drafting film to transfer this onto the walnut itself. All right, hopefully you can see this well enough. I've moved up to the loft of the shop for this part, just to give another surface to work on and where these ribs can sit out of the way. So what I've done is I've laid all 18 of my slices out in the order they were cut, and I've aligned them so that important bits of the figure are lined up so that they're not going to skew or misalign, because what winds up happening, if you get these ribs out of alignment, that is going to show up very strongly on the instrument where certain points that repeat in the grain don't match up. On this, it was fairly simple because there wasn't really anything that was running at an angle. There was so little run out in this that I could just line the ends up and it's going to be a beautiful repeated pattern. On some pieces, you need to make sure that that a knot or something, a flaw that is running through at an angle, is then at the same point across your finished ribs rather than traveling around the instrument. Unless what you're very specifically going for is kind of a barber pole effect, which in theory you could do with certain curly woods where the curl is at an angle, provided you don't mind that very strong swirling effect. So what I've done is set these out and then taken my number 1 rib, which I am setting on the 9th slice. That gives me the 15 I need to complete the instrument, 1 plus 7 on each side, plus 1 extra on each side in the case of an error, and then 1 to make the end clasp out of. So I take this, I set it on here, I mark the widest point of this rib, which is what I want to line up all the way around the instrument. That is where I want the most alignment. And then I'm going to use a straight edge to make a mark across every rib blank at that point. So now, as I make this instrument, when I am cutting out ribs, this is my pole star. This is what will guide me around that instrument so that all the grain is lined up from rib to rib as I work around, by making sure that this always aligns no matter what rib I'm on. The 6th cross section of the mold is beneath this line. And then on that line I will go on number 9 and I'm going to put a 1, because this is now going to be rib number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then in the opposite direction, I go 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. And those are now ready to make into ribs. So here I am back in the shop, or down from the loft rather. We were still in the shop with my number 1 rib and number 1 rib template. And what I've done is I've given myself a little center line here that I am lining this up with. I'm just taping that there. And taping it here. Now I am following that paper to create a rough outline. So my pencil line here is outside the line of my template, and I will cut outside my pencil line which by the time all this is done means I will have a nice, comfortable margin for error. And then, in order to give myself a little bit more, when I do this opposite side, I'm going to remove my tapes, hold this in place at the widest point, and I'm going to skew it about 5 millimeters that way. And then tape it. Mark it just to the widest point. The advantage of doing this with acrylic is that it's thick enough and stiff enough that you can actually run your pencil right along it. So I may wind up changing my mind about not making these into acrylic until I know they work. And then I'll do the same thing at the other end. I'll skew it from the wide point about 5 millimeters. Then tape it. And so that gives me one edge that is a fairly close line to where I want to wind up, and one that gives me some extra material to remove. So I will line up this edge that is more exact first, and then I will line up the edge that is less exact second when I am fitting this to the mold. In order to make this cut, I've set up the bandsaw with a more finely toothed blade. This is different than what we used for resawing because now the goal is not to remove a lot of material cleanly, but rather to make a very thin cut. So having extra teeth per inch gives me the stability to make that cut without it skipping too far ahead and chipping or tearing. And so now I will cut along, always outside of my line, never over the line, the rough shape of my rib. Bring the guide down closer to improve the accuracy of my cut. And off we go. And so with that cut out, we have our very first rib for the Theorbo ready to fit to the mold with the bending iron. We will use heat to transform this two-dimensional piece into a three-dimensional shape, into a curve that matches the back of that instrument. And that's what we'll be doing next time. Obviously, I've got a whole stack more of these to do, which I'm going to take care of by my lonesome. And then our next video will be bending this to shape and fitting it to the mold, which is a really interesting process. If you want to see that, make sure to subscribe so that you know when I've posted that video. Otherwise, thanks for watching. It's fun doing this, and if you got any questions, let me know, because I can't wait to answer them. Thanks.